I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of the first 2 weeks of August in 2018. So the first book that I had read, which I read while I was on my way to Calgary a couple of weeks ago, was Michael Ondaatje's Warlight, which is now on the long list for the Man Booker Prize. I've seen this described as being a less artsy version of his usual writing style, in that it does primarily follow a single character, and we follow this character first as a teenager when his parents both disappear under complicated circumstances, and then later as an adult as he ends up in a career that may or may not tell him more about what his parents were doing. Even saying it's less artsy than Ondaatje's usual writing style, it does still jump around quite a bit and leave a lot of things open for a long time, and sometimes leaves them open full stop. But at the same time as it was slightly more linear and straightforward than a lot of his stories, I think it had a lot less stickiness to it, and that I think Michael Ondaatje at his best can write in a style that almost rewrites reality. The two examples I always use is I always talk about how I always think of the nun falling off the Bloor Viaduct whenever I'm passing the Bloor Viaduct in Toronto, which the subway runs over on the Bloor line, and you also drive under it on the Don Valley Parkway. And still, even though it's been 20-something years since I first read that, I do still think of that nun. And similarly in The English Patient, there's a bit where Kip starts ranting about the use of atomic bombs. And it was one of those things that even though I've seen the movie probably a dozen times, I always kind of expect that scene to take place, even though I know it's not in the film version. Because I think that's kind of the power that some of Ondaatje's writing can have. And I didn't feel like there was anything really in here that was like that. So while I was slightly disappointed by that, I did think that this was quite excellent. Now that said, because I'm talking about this 2 weeks after I've read it, I feel like what has stayed with me is kind of that mood of the kind of mystery where this kid/man is trying to figure out exactly what happened and to rewrite his own life story in a way, which I do think is done really in a way that does feel like the way you think about the people who used to be in your life. There is in particular a character that the main character knows very briefly when he's in a kitchen job as a teenager, and he always thinks of that character throughout the rest of the life as we see him, and I thought that was done really well. So I thought this was excellent, but not as excellent as some of Michael Ondaatje's other writing has been for me personally. But I definitely enjoyed that one. And the next thing that I read was Maya Angelou's Hallelujah, the Welcome Table. The subheading on this one is A Lifetime of Memories with Recipes. This is roughly half recipe book and half series of essays. Now, I have heard that the audio version of this doesn't include the recipes, and I think that's a shame because, for one thing, that's half the book. And for the other thing, I think that a certain amount of the talk in the story is about the complexities or easiness of preparing certain meals is lost if you don't hear the steps of the recipes afterwards. So that's too bad. So if you're looking at this, I definitely would suggest picking up an ebook as I did, or a physical copy, and not the audio, because you miss half the content for that. This was much lighter and I think less reflective than a lot of Maya Angelou's writing is, but it was still lovely. It was a nice peek into various points in her life, which was surprising. I haven't read any of her other memoirs before, so for me this was my first glimpse into her history. And as someone who likes that merging of cooking and storytelling, I thought this was fantastic. But yeah, if you enjoy that style of writing, or if you were a huge fan of Maya Angelou, definitely pick this up. I thought this was very entertaining. I will say in terms of the recipes that if you are a vegan, there's probably almost nothing in here that you can eat. If you're a vegetarian, there might be a few of the desserts you could eat. If you want your food to be halal or kosher, maybe you can eat about half of the food in here. It's very heavy on the cream and the pork. But that said, if you're not planning to make the recipes, I think it would still be interesting, but just be aware that it is not designed for people with who are taking that kind of thing into consideration when you are eating, because yeah, there's a lot of cream and a lot of pig. Okay, next up, I read another memoir. That is Eve O. Schaub's Year of No Clutter. She's the same author who wrote A Year of No Sugar, which was her recounting of trying to cut down sugar in the life of her family. This is more or less a story about her realizing that she was in danger of becoming a hoarder, and this is the story of her trying to clear that out. I've talked about a number of anti-clutter books this year, and this is the one that is the least like a guidebook. This is definitely more memoir than self-help or how-to or whatever you want to call that genre. It was somewhat interesting to read, but I didn't see a huge point to it aside from being interesting from the perspective of someone who is naturally more of a pack rat and really trying to change not just the look of her house, but her actual habits in terms of picking things up and clearing things out. So I thought some of that was interesting, in no small part because right now I am trying to clear things out and get rid of things because I am moving in a couple of weeks. But yeah, I was both very engaged with it while I was reading it, but didn't think it was that impressive once I was finished with it. It was almost more like following somebody's blog than it was something with a cohesive storyline, because there wasn't really the kind of climax that you would normally see in something like this, where there's that kind of snap and their light opens and their life changes. There isn't a moment like that, which is, I think, realistic, but not what one normally sees in this style of plotted memoir. Still, it was entertaining enough, so. Next up, I read a book of essays in the form of Teju Cole's Known and Strange Things. These were fascinating. I'd say this is about equal thirds general culture, writing on literature, and writing on photography and art. And the writing on photography and fine arts I thought was really compelling in this, which I'm going to mention first off because when I went and added this to Goodreads, I looked at the reviews, and a lot of people were saying that they weren't engaged at all with the photography elements, but really enjoyed the literary parts. I felt almost exactly the opposite on this. And I was trying to think about why that might be, because I think stylistically they're written in very similar ways. And I think it might just come down to what people are interested in. I think a lot of people who are reading a book of essays are by nature more interested in the literary perspective than they are that same identical style of writing looking at visual arts on the other hand. So it might just be a matter of that, because I do appreciate photography. So just aside from the photography bits, some of the most interesting parts of this for me were his reflections on his relationship as a Nigerian American to European art as compared to the things that James Baldwin had written, staying in the same area of Switzerland, incidentally, a couple of generations before. And he has a lot of discussion about whether that's a generational thing versus a cultural thing, and whether having grown up in Nigeria created the ability to claim a connection to the art traditions of many cultures in a way that an African American growing up in the United States wouldn't have the same access to that, because they would be raised with this culture of exclusion rather than inclusion, which I thought was really interesting. He was born in the United States, but his parents were just graduate students. They were from Nigeria. They moved back when he was an infant. And so when he moved back to the US for university, he had essentially never lived there. He was essentially moving to a completely new culture. And there's a lot of interesting reflection on those kind of cultural elements, which I thought was really interesting. Just aside from the photography stuff, which I did think was great. Then we moved on to something else that I ended up not finishing, but it was something that I picked up for odd reasons. I was overhearing somebody at the gym talking about how they used to do the insanity workouts, which many people have seen infomercials for. And this woman was saying she'd read the host's book and he had such a hard life and blah, blah, blah. So I happened to come by the book at my local library, so I picked it up and was curious. And that is Shaun T's T is for Transformation. This is a bizarre book because it is about 1/3 memoir of his life, 1/3 inspirational nonsense, and 1/3 a guide to physical fitness. The memoir and the guide, I think, were great, and if it were just the two of those, or one or the other on its own, I think I would have kept going with this. But the interjections of inspirational nonsense were just so ridiculous, because there were For example, there's a chapter where he talks about how his stepfather sexually abused him as a child, which is horrific, but every few paragraphs will be interrupted with a box with a, here's an inspirational note that you can take away from this, which horrified me a little bit. And there's another chapter that's more of the guidebook, which is telling you here's how you pick a particular rhythm or beats per minute to set aerobics classes to if you're planning an aerobics class, which I think is really interesting. But then there'll be an inspirational block in the middle of that that interrupts it. So I couldn't keep reading this because it was just driving me around the bend, having to read all these cheesy inspirational bits. However, if you like that kind of inspirational stuff mixed in with your guidebook and you want to know more about this guy's life, it might be worth picking up, but I just couldn't handle all the inspirational cheese, which is too bad because the other parts of it were really engaging. Yeah, and I was really impressed with all the things he's done with his life considering how horrific his childhood was. And the points about how to set classes also very interesting, but yeah, I couldn't handle all the believe in yourself stuff. Speaking of stuff, because I've been on this clutter fix, I also picked up Unstuffed, Decluttering Your Home, Mind, and Soul, which is by Ruth Soukup. One of my neighbors really enjoyed this, and I was cautious going into it because I had heard that there was a religious element to this, and I'm a secular person, and aside from that, I'm not from the same religious tradition as this author. So I was not sure how good it was going to be, but my neighbor swears by her anti-clutter points, so I thought I would pick this up and read it. And I would say it was reasonable. There is nothing in this that other books covering similar territory cover, but it did put them all into a nice package. There is one chapter that is religious in particular, which I skipped because I'm not interested in that, but other than that, I didn't think it was particularly hitting you over the head with the religion. There were a bit of things where she talks about scheduling your house cleaning, and she does have on Sunday you go to church, but if you don't, you could just leave that out. And there were a few, the ends of each chapter had a religious quote, but again, it wasn't really a focus of the main text. So I thought this was actually pretty reasonable. And I understood why my neighbor enjoyed it, but I feel like if you've read any other book about decluttering, you don't necessarily need this. That's been my first half of the month. I'm gonna go back to packing now. I hope your August has been going well. I can't believe we're halfway through August already, because that means I am, yeah, I'm moving in less than half a month. So that will be wild. We'll see how things go. Yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.